Okay, as it was mentioned, I'm Erich Siismets. I live in Andover here. I've been living in Andover since 1960, where I bought a small farm, and I worked 35 years for United Technology Corporation Research Center. Now I've been retired for 20 years, been back to Estonia a few times, and the question is, why are we here? What caused us to leave the old country? The main problem was that two large countries, Russia and Germany, made an agreement in late 1930s and divided Europe between themselves without asking anybody else. Then in 1939 there was a small border incident between Poland and Germany, and Germany started warring with Poland. But since the European division had been decided by Russia and Germany, immediately Russia came in, grabbed the other half of the Poland. So there was obviously some friction there, and Russia decided to occupy the countries that they had agreed upon: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, half of Poland. And in German part, Germany was supposed to take Hungary, Austria, and Czechoslovakia and countries down south. Well, we don't know exactly what caused what was the incident why Germany declared war on Russia, because they had all kinds of self-help agreements and so forth, but politicians are funny, they can change overnight their thoughts. And so there was later on, 1940, when the war started. But before the war started, that is, before the actions from Germany to Russia, Russia occupied, as I mentioned, the Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and they gave an ultimatum to our countries that either you change your government or we will come in and we will dictate what you do. Well, they had 100,000 men on a border. Estonian army was only 25,000. So the government, Estonian government, decided that it'd be better to let the Russians come in, because we couldn't fight them anyhow, too few of us. So they came in, and they very shortly arrested our Riigipäev, that's the representatives that Estonia sends to Tallinn, to the government. These people are arrested with the government of Estonia, the ministers and our president and General Laidoner. All these were deported to Siberia. And then they put up their own puppet government, but the deportations continued. For example, the night of June 13 and 14, the Russians arrested over 10,000 people. 10,000 people arrested in one night in Estonia alone. More in Latvia and Lithuania, but at the same time in all these three states. And this occurred so that you were asleep. You didn't know that anything was happening. All of a sudden at 2 or 3 o'clock somebody's banging at the door. When you went to open, there was a soldier with a gun that pointed at you, say, "You are arrested. Get together, dress, and you're going to be loaded on a truck." And they deported you up to the railroad station, put people into the cattle or cattle cars, as they were called, 40 or 50 people into each one of these railroad cars. no facilities whatsoever. No toilets, no water, no nothing. No beds, no seats, chairs, sit or anything. And if you consider this 10,000 people and 40 into each wagon or freight car, it had to be an awful long train. But these trains all started going towards Russia. Well, that was the night of 13th and 14th of June. This shook Estonia very much because a lot of the middle class was deported. But also our two neighbors, we lived on a farm close to Rakvere, and two of our neighbors were deported. We were on a list also deported, our family, but somehow we didn't complain. They didn't deport us that time, but we were on a list to be deported. And so about 1941, June 22, Germany attacked Russia. Now that sometimes is considered the beginning of a Second World War. And then, of course, Russia was in desperation. Now they were arresting more people, deporting to Siberia. A lot of them were just shot in Estonia. By the way, there's Martinson family. Their grandfather was deported. He was an officer in the Estonian army. The army higher officers were called in, and on the pretext that they have to be taught new weapons, and the weapons were taught, the handling of the new weapons was taught in Moscow. So they were all taken to Moscow. When they arrived in Moscow, their uniforms were taken away from them, the insignias were ripped off their shoulders, all personal stuff was thrown away and said, "You are under arrest." They were arrested, sent to Norilsk, I believe. It's the place in Russia where 95% of them were murdered, were shot. They had no explanation why they were deported. The only reason was that they were anti-communist. That was all. Well, anyhow, since I mentioned that we were on the list of deportation, now 1942-43, the Germans start to lose their grip on Russian, and the Russians were fighting and coming towards the west. Well, before long they were at Narva River, and very active fighting was going on. There were a lot of wounded soldiers and so forth. Our high schools were stopped in March 1942. Sorry, a couple of corrections here. The fighting that I'm talking about actually was taking place in beginning of 1944. So that the schools were closed and they were used as field hospitals. My high school, where I was standing on second class, it was closed and used as a field hospital. And very shortly after that was, I guess, in summertime, when the German army was losing heavily in the southern section of Europe, and all the German arms that were in Baltic countries were called home. And this was in September, when one of the officers told us that German armies have been called back and they will leave Estonia, then we had a choice. Are we going to stay, wait to be overrun by the Russians and deported to Siberia, or do we expect to go somewhere else, move? Well, we lost a lot of sleep. That was Sunday, September the 18th. But Monday morning, my parents decided that we had to move. We had to get out of the way because we could hear the front moving closer. So it was so close already that you could hear the cannons and machine guns. So we left the country, left Estonia, or actually Rakvere, and then we found that all the railroads and all the highways were crowded with retreating people. We were able to get onto it was a train full of Russian prisoners, war prisoners, that were moved from the front towards the west, towards Tallinn. And we are on the puffers between the cars. There was a little different setup in European railroad system than it's here, but we were standing on the puffers between the cars, and finally we arrived into Tallinn. Tallinn was again very crowded, and we wanted to go to Sweden. There were no boats available. Nothing was moving anymore. This one was on the 22nd of September. And finally, we were able to board on the German Red Cross ships. And we went on to Moiro. You probably might have heard that there was a ship, Moiro. But it was so crowded that we says, well, next to the Moiro there was another ship that still had some room on the deck. We came off the Moiro, went to the other ship, and the Moiro took off from the harbor, and it was sunk. I think several hundred people drowned because the Russian aircraft sent torpedoes out and dropped torpedoes on them, and that sank the Moiro. Our ship did not go at nighttime. We pulled off the harbor, and we were watching when Russian airplanes were bombing Tallinn. Tallinn was burning. But in the morning we started to move, and we had 4 or 5 ships in a group. And again, by Libav, that's part of Latvia, the Russian airplanes came out and they threw torpedoes. Luckily, the torpedoes missed us. But one of the torpedoes ricocheted off the water and went through the chimney of one of the big ships. Later on, we could see in the harbor when we got to Copenhagen, we saw that there was a big hole in the chimney. So we had now decided that we had no place to go. We couldn't go back. We only could go forward. It was very difficult decision to go to Germany because Germany was losing the war. But yet they were nice enough to let us in, and we got to Germany. They asked, do you have any address where you want to go? Well, my classmate, Heino Jõgis from Rakvere, had gotten to Germany a little bit before that. He was visiting his aunt that lived in close to Halle and Leipzig. Well, we gave the people in Copenhagen, when we landed, that this address. They said, fine, you're free to go. do you have money to buy the tickets? Yes, we had money, we bought the railroad tickets, but now the railroads are so crowded you couldn't get in. The doors are jammed, people are on top of the railroad cars riding, and there was 5 of us, me, my sister, my brother, my mother, and then our neighbor Edward Maide. So there was 5 of us, but luckily we had one of the red caps, as they call them. These were the German railroad officials. He opened one of the doors there, says, make room, there's 5 more people coming in. People complained, but we got in and we finally got to our destination. Leaving to Estonia was really difficult. It was something like you people left your home today, but you know you're going to get back. Well, we never did. We left, we couldn't get back. Our father, he says, I will let the animals out, because it was a farm. We had dairy cows and we had horses and sheep and everything else. They were in the buildings. And he says, I'll let them out so that in case the buildings catch fire, they don't get burned. And I'll catch up with you. Well, he never caught us, because next day the Russians are already in Rakvere. We left on 18th, I guess 19th, they were already there. And we don't know what happened to him, but later on we found out that he was definitely on the list to be deported. The family would have been also deported. And he got sick, he went to a hospital. The hospital refused to accept him because it says, you are a kulak. That's what they terminated people, when the ones that were to be shipped out. And they refused him any medication, and he died at the end of January 1949. But he had been told already that he will be deported in March, and that was the March, was it March 18th or 19th, when there was another big deportation. So we missed our first deportation, and we missed the second deportation, and we missed the Moiro. So we were looking ourselves that we are kind of lucky that in that respect. And then when we were in Germany, we were in a displaced persons camps. I went to Kaisingen on the Steige, where I graduated from a high school. And then at that time, we received visas from a far-fetched relative. We didn't even know that he existed. Somehow we had found out that we were in Germany. He sent us visas from United States. And lo and behold, I graduated from high school, I guess it was beginning of May, and by June 25th we landed in New York. So it happened very quickly after that. So we are very happy in that respect. And since we got into this country here, on the visa I read one section, there's, in case of war, will you be willing to serve in the US Army? Well, the war just ended, big war. What they're talking about, another war. I signed it. As soon as I got there, Uncle Sam called me. They wanted me in a service. That was the Korean time. So they drafted me, and I served 2 years in the US Army. But for some reason, they wanted to send me to Korea, where the fighting was taking place. Someone else crossed out my name and wrote his name in place of my name. And I checked with the proper authorities, they say if the person wants to go there, let him go. You go somewhere else. They shipped me to Germany. So I was back to Germany, but now I was a big deal. I was in a US uniform, and I enjoyed my time very much. In fact, I was an interpreter for the battalion. So I had a very, very easy time. I moved around freely in the country, in Germany, and I went to Zugspitze a couple of times and was ready to come down a big Olympic jump, but wasn't enough snow at that time. So that kind of explains why we are here, but this also explains why we haven't gone back, is namely, we had the UEKN, that is the World Council meeting, annual meeting in Washington, where our ambassador was also present. And then he was urging everybody to come back to Estonia. I says, well, what would you give me as a job? I am an engineer. Oh, we'll give you a job. I says, at what price? They said, well, but bring your sons along anyhow. So I said, well, do you have automobile fabrication? No, my older son is in Detroit, works as an engineer for GM. And then my younger one is here in Connecticut working for the submarines. Says, do you have jobs for them? Oh no, but we could probably find something else. Mrs. Not likely. They are getting very good pay. They have their own homes. They have the family. Kids are going to school. You're going to rip all these people out of this life and bring it over here. You don't even have places to go to, because the farm that we had been taken over, and the Russians were growing silver foxes on our farm. 12,000 pelts a year, very large setup. And when I went there to look at the buildings, 3 of the 4 buildings were burned. I don't know why they burned them, but I understood that there had been very cold winters, and these were log buildings. They just cut one log at a time and burned it to keep themselves warm. So we had no place to go to, and that's why we're still here, because the return to old country is something that, if you are a single, you have no family, you have no investments or houses or living quarters here, then it's easy to go to the back in the old country. But to rip up everything here and to move, it just cannot happen. And it's unfortunate as it is. We have to live here. But just the same, you can be proud to be Estonian. Estonia is a small country, but they have done very well since the Russians were moved out again. 1993, I believe, they finally left Estonia. The country has blossomed, and first time I went visiting in 1993, the stores were empty, there was nothing there. Second time we went, I think was 4 or 5 years later, the stores were full of everything. And the systems that they used in the stores, it was very much similar to American setup. And there were so many American products there, so that you could have anything you wanted. So I recommend that you do visit Estonia. It's a nice country, but as I have said, I will not go back because I have no place to go, and I've lost all close relatives. it's very difficult to go back there because the people that in Estonia now look at us as foreigners coming from a foreign country. And if you go for a job interview or something, it's not likely that you will get the job because at home there is so much joblessness. People are moving out of Estonia, now young ones going out to Europe to earn money as truck drivers or laborers or whatever, because Estonia does not have any large industry to keep the young people at home. Now, does anyone have any questions? No questions. Well, be proud that you are American.
How old were you when you left Estonia and left Germany?
How was that?
Were you? How old vanha olit, kun sä lähtöisit?
I was 16 years old when I left Estonia. So I remember things very well. And now I am 84. I'm still going, so I don't know what happens, but
I think that's important also for them to think about, how old they are, and some of them are 16 or almost 16. Imagine leaving your home here in this country and going to a totally different country. It would be very difficult.
yes, it was.
On one day's notice.
Yeah,
There's
hours of notice, because you heard the cannons and things going off, the explosions. You just had to make up your mind that now you are going. Of course, we did not come out with the idea that we never go back. But once we got to Tallinn, there was no return, because I guess it was a couple of days later Tallinn was run over by the Russians. So now we had to leave Estonia. That was the hardest part, to leave the country. But once we left country and we were in Germany, then we had the problem that even the Russians are there trying to tell the Americans that all these people from East Europe, they belong to Russia. And there were times when the Americans gave up Estonians that were in Czechoslovakia or some places, and the Russians took them back, of course, and shipped them to Siberia. When I was in a service, U.S. Army, there was a Russian soldier also in service, and he had only one eye. The other one was a glass eye. I says, how come? He says, well, he was taken as a child from Russia by some German army officer who felt sorry for him because he had lost his parents, and brought him to Germany. And so he was working in Germany and living in Germany. And then when Russians came, of course, he was happy to go back to Russia. He went with open arms to the Russians. They put him into the old concentration camps so that nobody could escape. And then they started questioning. Then they were questioning people. They were actually causing bodily harm. All this, they beat him so much that he lost one of the eyes. Yet the concentration camps were surrounded with mines, ground mines, underground mines. He went particularly into that minefield to blow himself up. But he was so lucky he did not step on any of the mines, and he got out of that camp and he went over. That was in the East Germany part. And he came over to American side, and one of the guys again, Americans, helped him, and he got into U.S. as a U.S. citizen. I don't know if he had citizenship, but anyhow, he was in the service. And we talked about these things, and he was very disappointed that his own friends, his own country people, beat him so badly. They tried to get all kinds of information out of the people. Communism was very rough. Ideally, probably wasn't meant to be so rough, but the people in front caused the problem, and that was the problem. That's our neighbors, both sides of our farm, they died in Siberia. We have no real information, but I saw a writing in one of the papers that the initials of the neighbor's kid was given. He was my age at that time. We went to school together. That he went out in a swamp to pick up some kind of berries, and he didn't come back. He obviously sank into the mire in a swamp, because these areas where the people were working were large areas, and they were forced to work daily, and they didn't have enough nourishment, so they tried to get berries or whatever available to help them. The idea was to get rid of these Estonians, so that's why they are put into these unhuman situations. They had to, usually they trap them somewhere in the woods. It says, now you gotta go to work tomorrow morning. Didn't have any shelter whatsoever. So people dug into the ground and put boughs over the openings and dirt on top of that, so they had some kind of place to crawl into. And these people were, what did they do wrong? They did nothing wrong. They were just everyday people, working people, but that was the idea of kill the nation. And the Russians did a very good job. We had about 1,200,000 before the war, and now there's about 800,000 left. And in 1944, when the Russians came back in, about 70,000 Estonians escaped from the Russian, or from the Estonia. We are in Sweden, Germany, Canada, US, and England, and many other countries. Even Estonians in Africa, South Africa. So Estonians all over the country. I guess I'll, unless there's some more questions.
Any other questions? Well, we thank you very much.
Yeah, it was rough life, but make the best of it.
Your family was fortunate that they were able to come
Yeah.
to America. Thank you. And I hope we're going to have other grandparents come to talk about how they left us and what their life was. Family history.
What's that?
Very
How did I lose a finger? No, I chopping with the axe. And got in the way. I was chopping wood. When I was young, I was 11 years old. No, it hurt a little bit, but not too much. I've lived without it now all these years. Yeah, but I can work all right. I have to watch it. I don't hurt it. That's all. But otherwise, it's all right.